As the fiery red shield floated there, standing between me and Alice, I nearly collapsed, grasping at my chest, trying to slow my heartbeat, my breath completely out of control. I was gasping for every breath. After a moment, the red floating shield dissipated, and Alice seemed to relax, thankfully. Great! It looks like you found out what it is. Congratulations, Reginald. You just cast your first spell. At the moment, I found it hard to feel joyful in the experience. Alice gave me a little while to cool down. Afterwards, we finally started making our way back. We found our way to the clearing where Eliza was still face deep into the magical index. So, Reginald,
Eliza
announced, how does it feel to finally be a magic caster? Sore, I said, palming at my knees, still scraped up from the run, and my palms feeling no better. I had small scrapes and cuts just about everywhere from running woods. My clothes weren't in any better condition. I was actually surprised to see your spell take effect, Alice announced. Well, of course it makes sense that you're a snapper, but I didn't expect the color of your energy or that fire. It was quite impressive, Alice said. To be honest, in the panic, I didn't really think much of it. I was simply relieved that it actually worked. Believe it or not, Reginald, you can actually have a good feel of who somebody is by the magic they cast. That is, if you can remember all the silly nonsense that goes along with it. All the little details. Basically, if you have a good enough memory, you can basically tell who someone is by the magic they cast and the way they cast it. It sounds delightful, Alice, I said, still not really feeling joyful in the moment. Actually, she's right, Eliza said, looking up from the magical index. After you started your training, she said hesitantly, with Alice, I took the liberty of starting to look up triggers for magic. I was hoping that maybe there was a less scary way of doing it. Finding your trigger, of course. And I actually found one. It's a lot more time consuming, but according to the book, doesn't have a fatality rate like the method Alice was using. What? I shouted loudly. You mean that whole ordeal was completely pointless? Alice just stood there smiling. Oh, pish-posh. Stop being a killjoy, Eliza. That silly method could take forever. Days, if not weeks. My method was much faster. Yes, of course, Alice, Eliza announced. She is right. The method she used is much faster in getting a result. The method listed in the book basically means that you have to go through every different casting trigger, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. It's much slower, but also much safer. I think despite the speed disadvantage, I'm going to go with the slower method for learning my trigger. I took a deep breath, rolled my hands down my face in frustration. At least it's over, I thought. And then something else occurred to me. I never actually found out which of the three initial caster types I was. I looked angrily over at Alice. Say, Alice, I said, you do realize that if I had been an item type caster needing a focus, then that whole little event would have just ended with me dying, right? Alice looked over at me with a confused expression. What are you talking about, Reginald? I thought you already knew you weren't an items caster. I mean, it's fairly obvious. And what makes you say that, Alice? I said angrily, still, with a probably not so pleasant expression on my face. Well, it's simple, silly. The magical index. The magical index effectively isn't a magic item. It requires a small amount of magical energy from the person summoning it in order to take its form. If you were an item caster, you still would have needed an item in order to use it, because you wouldn't have been able to channel any magic energy without it. But because you can summon it without an item, that means you couldn't have been an items caster. It's fairly obvious. Okay, so at least Alice knew that there wasn't a 1 in 3 chance that I was going to die for certain, which raises the odds a bit, but that game was still too much, I thought to myself. I was still having a hard time shaking it off. Well, it looks like Alice is also right about being able to tell a lot about a caster by the way they cast magic, and even the color of the magic they cast. As I stopped to think about it, I actually noticed that Alice didn't do anything when she cast the spell on the knife. Hey Alice, what's your trigger? I didn't see you do it, I said. Was it just something I didn't notice? Alice looked over at me with a smile. Oh no, silly. My casting trigger is called empty. It's a very specific magical trigger. Basically, mine is that I don't really have one. Meaning, of all the different triggers you can have, I don't have any. I don't do basically anything at all before I cast a spell. Magical index, magical triggers, empty, I heard Eliza announce from above the magical index. Seeing the pages whirl by, Eliza began to read. Eliza said. It says here that the magical trigger empty is among the rarest magical triggers in existence. In fact, it's almost impossible to find somebody who has it. Those that possess the magical trigger empty fall into the personality set of predatory behavior, tend to exhibit symptoms such as psychopathy, multiple personality syndrome, enhanced aggression and violence, manipulative behavior, a desire to see the pain and suffering of others, Eliza continued to read, seeming more and more worried as she went on. It says here that if you ever meet somebody with the magical trigger empty, you should be heavily wary. Your first instinct should probably be to run the other direction. Of all those who have ever become well known possessing the magical trigger empty, some of the most terrifying individuals that have ever struck the pages of history possessing the magical trigger empty have always been those of the darkest intentions. Eliza read, and started to look up from the magical index to see Alice standing over her, smiling down. Well, aren't you just quick-witted with that little book, she says. At that point, Eliza looked quite afraid. She nervously laughed. Maybe the book isn't right. Based on what Eliza read, it sounded like that book was dead on. I wonder what it says about snappers. Hey Eliza, what does it say about people with the magical trigger snap, or snappers, as Alice called it? Eliza warily looked back to the magical index. Magical index, magical triggers, snappers. The pages once again whirled by.
Eliza.
And began to read again. Well, it says here that snappers are people of a fastidious nature, tending to be tidy, neat, and orderly, the type of individuals who prefer structure and order in things. They also tend to be very intelligent, sometimes cunning. Apparently, being a snapper is more of a rare quirk when it comes to magic casting triggers, but not completely unheard of. Eliza said. Magical index. Color representation in magic casting. Once again, the pages whirled by, and after they stopped, Eliza began to read again. It appears that she was also right about the importance of color in magic casting. Lots of different casters have different color palettes when it comes to the type of things that get summoned when they cast magic, or the color of the magic that they cast. It says here for the color red, that while most people tend to associate the color red with anger or aggression, in this case it tends to represent activeness. The type of person who prefers to actively forge the path ahead of them, rather than someone who is more go with the flow and tends to simply accept things the way they are and go with the flow, as it says. People with the color palette red usually tend to be those who actively try to enforce their own desires and make them a reality rather than hoping they will be. Eliza looked down at the book for a few more minutes, reading through, when she came across something she apparently thought was interesting. She had a somewhat surprised look on her face. It says here that elements reflected in magic casting when there was no elemental spell cast, is often a reflection of the individual as well. This is often a reflection of a unique spiritual trait, a unique magical essence that's much more rare, existing within the soul of the individual. There are lots of different elements that could possibly emerge, but it says here that fire can represent a number of things. For some, it can represent rage. Somebody who carries a lot of rage inside of them, anger towards things. It can also be representative of desire. Just as a fire consumes everything around it in order to grow and expand, people who have fire represented within their casting often have a burning desire or an ambitious part of them. Basically, kind of like a burning desire to succeed or fulfill a goal, sometimes to push oneself or better themselves. Regardless of which it is, it always comes down to a desire, something powerful that exists within the individual that pushes them forward.